Thanks, Gannat. Thank you all for showing up. I caught the last piece of that cooking class, and now I'm hungry, having not had breakfast here at 9 o'clock in the morning. But I think I'll go make some miso soup after this is over. I chose this topic because I think it's incredibly important for our macrobiotic community, in that we have a tendency to have a separate feeling about our special way of seeing the world, when in fact we're all really alike. Whoever we are, be those people who are vegan macrobiotics or people who are at the drive-through for McDonald's. And compassion kind of helps us develop a meaningful connection with a lot of different kinds of people. Being compassionate also helps us solve problems, our own problems as well as those of other people. So if you look at the word, first of all, the Latin kind of breakdown of cum and passion. Cum is really an introduction to the word with, like when we community with unity, right? Cum is with, and passion is really about suffering. It's like the passion of Christ. So the definition for me of compassion is being in the presence of suffering. Now, that's not something a lot of us really want to do. It's more something we like to avoid, but it's a reality in all of our lives. And how we go about relating to suffering has a lot of different variables. To be in the presence of suffering, compassion's really about putting aside judgment and just refusing to turn away from any kind of challenging situations or those things that make us uncomfortable. It's also about understanding and examining our own realities, our own challenges, and the struggles that we face ourselves, as well as the people around us, the kinds of things that others are facing. We're called upon with compassion to kind of put away judgment. And that's not always so easy, because there's a lot of New Age mischief out there, particularly the kind of thing which says we shouldn't have judgment. Some people say that, it's no judgments, but much better. It's impossible. Think for a moment about a few different situations, like a man, you're sitting at a coffee shop or in a store, and you see a guy walk in. He's got this huge scar on his face from his ear down the side of his cheek into his throat. He's got a trench coat on. His hair is sort of greasy and combed back. His hands are in his pockets. You're going to have judgment. You may not know that he's a nuclear physicist or that he's a kindergarten teacher, but because of our exposure to Hollywood, to television, to our past, we have a judgment about that person just for a moment. We can't help it. Think about getting on a plane, waiting to board an airplane, and we see this obese woman, 400 plus pounds. She's walking by and pulling a rolling bag. You have a judgment about that. You're thinking, perhaps, I hope she doesn't get on my plane and sit next to me. Or maybe you'd like to get to know her because your judgment is that she must be very interesting. We have a judgment no matter what. There's a famous story of Stephen Covey, who tells about some unruly kids on a train when he was there one Sunday morning on a subway. And these kids came in with what appeared to be their father, and they were running around and jumping and tearing the newspaper from people and making noise and hanging from the poles. And Covey was thinking, God, this father is just a terrible parent. Why isn't he controlling the kids? And he finally says something to the father who was totally disconnected and had his head down and wasn't looking at his kids. And the guy looked up and called his kids back and said, sit down, and turned to Covey and said, I'm sorry, we've just come from their mother's funeral. Really, we have judgment. So it's not so much about that as it is about attachment to judgment. What is it that we're attached to, and how easy it is to make a judgment and possibly then to let go of the attachment to it. When we do let go, we have an opportunity to practice compassion about those kids, about that woman, about that guy, whoever he is, whatever he does, where he got that scar. When I was in Africa once, walking through an area of tremendous slum, I was with a guide who told me as we turned a corner to be very vigilant as we came across these women at the end of a long path. He warned me not to look at them too long. He said they were like sirens, that they would have an amazing way of controlling my vision and even kind of overtaking me with some magic of some sort. And I thought this was kind of intriguing and didn't have any idea what he meant. But as we got closer, I saw these women, and they were really something. They were dressed in this very colorful garb, these dashikis with various patterns. They were standing and some were kneeling. There were 5 or 6 of them. And the closer I got, the more I could see they were working with some kind of beads or making necklaces or doing something. And he kind of poked me and didn't say anything, but I remembered that he had warned me not to look at them too much. And as I got closer, I did look in their eyes, and they were amazingly beautiful. I mean, they were truly electric in their sight. And yet some kind of cognitive dissonance then occurred, because no sooner had I looked in their eyes than I realized their faces were horribly disfigured. Their faces were covered with moles and birthmarks, and moles on top of moles, and on their nose and on their cheek. By Western standards, the judgment would be that these women were ugly. They were even homely. But when I looked in their eyes, I saw beauty. I saw the most beautiful women I think I had ever seen. And as I got closer and closer, these two messages, these opposites, were screaming at me. And my guide pulled me past them as I looked at them, and we kept walking. And as we went further, right, I looked back and then said to him, what was that? I don't understand. What did I just experience? And he then said that those women came from a village where the water was contaminated with some kind of metals, copper or lead, and that during the pregnancy of their mothers, they all had these affects, this mineral concentration. And all of these girls were born with these moles and these marks. And they were told from a very young age that this was a sign of God, that this was a sign of beauty, that they were the most beautiful women in the world. They were the special chosen ones. So here were these women who, looking through their eyes at me and others, knew how special they were, because they were told that from a very young age. They knew they were the most beautiful. Yet from the outside, my judgment gave me something to hold on to, the attachment of past learning, of homeliness, of ugly, of moles. But that's not the message that these women carried. And so I walked away with kind of this realization that compassion is this tool that we can use to create a strong connection and build a relationship if from the inside we're able to understand our own suffering, our own childhoods, what we were told, our own learned behaviors. If we really truly care about other people and what they're experiencing from our own experience, we can become a lot better able to respond in helpful ways. So for me, compassion has always helped me approach situations with kindness and interest, an approach that I've found creates a trust, which sometimes isn't so easy to generate in relationship with people who think so differently. Compassion pushes us, it pushes me to look at inequality, to think about cruelty, to look at the struggles that other people are going through. And yet it naturally encourages me to be kind when I think about that. And it allows me to see other people like ourselves and how we might be able to help them as we hold space for them in different ways than we might otherwise act. I remember once walking along a hallway after greeting a woman who flew to New York in order to see His Holiness the Dalai Lama. She was a client of mine. She had been responsible for helping to start Tibet House. And so she knew the Dalai Lama personally, and she was going to see him together with hundreds of other people at a ritual called the Kala Chakra, which I attended with her that time in New York City. I went to the hotel to meet her, and she was suffering from HIV, from AIDS, and actually ended up dying a couple months later. So this was kind of her last visit to see the Dalai Lama and to attend the Kala Chakra. Tina was in a hotel suite, and when I went to the door of the suite, I knocked and she opened it. She had an aide with her, and that aide helped her get her coat on and handed her a cane. And then she put her arm through mine, and we walked down the corridor of this hotel, past a housekeeper with her cart. And Tina looked at the woman and said, "Good morning." And I said, "Good morning." The housekeeper said, "Good morning." We went to the elevator, which was not there. She pushed the button. Another couple came. She turned to the couple and said, "Good morning." And they said, "Good morning." We got on the elevator. We went down. We walked by the front desk. She turned to the people at the front desk. She said, "Good morning." The people said, "Good morning, Miss Chow." We went outside. There was a car waiting for us. The driver said, "Good morning." She said to the driver, "Good morning." And we got in the car. We drove to Radio City. We went to a special entry where we could go through the back where security was there. We got out of the car. Security greeted us. Tina looked at the security guard. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." We went through some doors. We went down a hallway. We went to the outer room where the Dalai Lama was. There was a guard there, an assistant. She said, "Good morning." The guard said, "Good morning, Miss Chow." And then we went in to see His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. And Tina looked at him and said, "Good morning." And His Holiness said, "Good morning." She treated everyone exactly the same. The housekeeper was the Dalai Lama. The couple, the front desk people, the driver, the security guards, all of them equal. Really, following macrobiotic principles allows us a unique opportunity to develop an unusual kind of awareness. And that's a key to expanding our consciousness. You know that after many years, macrobiotic people begin to develop a kind of heightened sensitivity, an awareness in their own bodies. It's a kind of innate wisdom because we start to align with the energies and environment around us. So perhaps one of the unacknowledged gifts of macrobiotics is the chance to embrace that sensitivity in a way that the Buddhists called bodhicitta. And it was that ritual that I attended with Tina and others, the Kalachakra, led by the Dalai Lama, which was a study of an experience of bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is translated loosely as a kind of awakening mind, or the thought of enlightenment. And it's out of that comes a commitment to embark on or move through a path of service to others, primarily to relieve suffering. Much of what we've done in macrobiotics is aimed toward that in terms of recovering our health, our own, and then teaching and spreading the word so that others can become healthy and relieve their own suffering. But in other words, it's really an awakening of the heart to dedicate ourselves to the liberation of all beings and to the relief of suffering of others. Bodhicitta, this awakened heart, is actually born out of compassion. It's a desire to be free from that suffering and to free all other beings from suffering, even those who we might wish harm or who we might consider as enemies. Bodhicitta and this study is actually one of the foundations of the Mahayana tradition of Buddhism, in which bodhicitta is woven into many of the teachings. And suddenly, in early days, both Asawa and Kushi were very keen about that kind of practice. Practitioners of bodhicitta embrace a teaching because they identify with all beings and they recognize that we're all connected. Micho's kind of mantra, we are all brothers and sisters. We have all come from one family, he would say at the end of one seminar, every seminar. And in that recognition, we were striving to free ourselves and others, right, from the sense of separation and from suffering. Bodhicitta practices weave together those kinds of energies for cultivating a compassion and a generosity with those others that deepens our own understanding of personal suffering. Because really, if we can't practice compassion for ourselves, if we can't be in the presence of our own suffering, right, which is much harder to hold, then it's really difficult to hold that space for others. So you might ask yourself, for all of us who are gathered this morning, can I be in the presence of my own suffering? Can I simply be a sacred witness to my own challenges without judgment, without attachment to that judgment which might involuntarily arise? People often call me and come to me for advice about how to be with someone who is dying. My own study for many years with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and with Sogyal Rinpoche and others who are practicing palliative care and work with people who are dying allowed me to be of service to those who would come into contact with people. And really, for a long time, macrobiotic counselors, we've seen our share of people who don't make it, even in the middle of their lives, and especially the longer we live, as we grow older, we know we'll also face it. So when people come to me with questions about how they can help their partner or their father or their grandmother, right, I say the same thing over and over. And that is, this is your experience. This is your one time of being with your partner or with your grandmother. Have your experience of suffering. Be in the presence of your own experience, not the other person's. Simply by being there and being a sacred witness to what you are going through this one time, the only time you will be with your father or your grandmother or your friend who is dying. This one time is a time for you to be in the presence of your own suffering. As we grow older, as time goes on, we can come to find a possibility of nestling the twins of grief and hope together in our own arms. That's what might symbolize an ability to embrace opposites. It's a kind of exercise of the unifying principle, hope and grief. They seem very different, but we can hold them both together. They're like twins, and we need to have both of them in our hearts to be in the presence of suffering, to practice compassion. In that way, we can recognize everything as a helper. Both grief and hope become more than just ordinary emotions. They become teachers because they bring us closer to the wisdom inside us. And we realize more and more that we're really never apart from that innate nature, that wisdom inside our own body, what I call that chunk of gold. When people are in despair, when they're just feeling so helpless and hopeless, full of grief, right? That's part of that chunk of gold we have deep inside us that no one can ever take away, that innate nature. And it doesn't just happen when we age. An awakened mind doesn't change just because it grows older. It's simply an awareness. Many times we have it as a teenager, as a young adult, where we begin to see life beyond bias, beyond differences or partiality that right now in society seems to be the way in which most people are witnessing the world. All these differences, all this diversity, all this polarity. I try every day in looking at the world to embrace everything with a spirit of mindful compassion. So for me personally, I found that compassion isn't simply about understanding someone else's situation. It's about looking at my own and about being inspired to act. When I led teams to places where there were earthquakes or tsunamis, cyclones, like in the Philippines, or bombings, like in the Baltic region in the early 90s, war-torn countries, where there was widespread upheaval on every level, I regularly witnessed the trauma of children in those communities, but I also saw their resilience. Only 30 minutes from here, where I sit now, I sat in circles with children from Newtown, from the school where shooters, right, have visited, right, in countries where survivors of sex trafficking faced unspeakable memories, hundreds of friends in Japan and Samoa and others in displaced communities that came after a tsunami left them and their families who needed support with unspeakable difficulties when they were freaked out, lost their homes and possessions, walking along the shore of Ishinomaki and Kesunuma in Japan, or along the areas of Samoa. I exposed myself to those extremes purposefully, facing some of the most devastating environments one could imagine. Sometimes scenes of unthinkable horror, victims of torture and survivors of rituals, and pretty much the worst of the worst. Why would I do that? Because I came to find out that I've always been somehow the calm in the eye of a storm. I don't know why or why that is, and it's not so special. It's just in my bones. So specifically, in those circumstances, I function at my best. Those experiences were teachers of compassion and opportunities for me to practice, not necessarily only while I was there, but when I left, sensing the armor that I would build to protect myself from experiencing the grief that was so profound. I would get on an airplane and weep. I would cry for hours, and cabin attendants would come and say, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" And I'd be crying and crying and crying. And only weeks later, I would come to that place of hope, that twin of grief. I hope through this short talk, I can inspire you to take the time to listen to others close to your home without attachment, just being a sacred witness to people's differing perspectives. And there are certainly a lot of those around right now. Even supporting them in their own personal inquiries to find out where they belong and what's right for them, and to continue to offer ways to explore those questions together, not apart. It means being there for them, especially people who are facing mental challenges, depression, and traumas. We can let them know they can count on us. You can be a friend, no matter what your differences are, when you see the world so opposite of the way they may. Practicing compassion and even remembering George Osawa's encouragement to create difficulties wherever you go in today's world isn't so hard. We find ourselves facing difficulties or witnessing others who face tremendous challenges next door, in our own family, across the street, or through a Zoom call. It's my hope that we can all be there for them and for ourselves, to be in the presence of suffering, to show up with compassion. Thank you, Ginat, for organizing this, for your team, Mike and others, and nameless people behind the scenes who put these kind of things together. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with so many of you, and I wanted to leave adequate time for any kind of discussion and questions. If that was appropriate, we can come together and explore this topic. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bill. It's an inspired talk. I'm very moved. And I love Osawa's injunctive to create difficulties or seek difficulties.
Right.
Such an enlightened view. You know, I tried to run away from them and solve them, and oh my God. Yeah.
It's a little hard to do these days, isn't it?
Very refreshing. Yeah, it's not one thing, it's another.
Yeah.
Michelle, did you want to say something? Yeah.
Yeah, hi, William. I'm studying social work, and I really enjoyed your talk today. It was very inspiring. And with that said, I've been struggling with, I have a neighbor who lives right next door to me. He has cancer in his leg, nicest guy and young. And I was struggling with, how do I approach him? I'm studying macrobiotics. So how do I say, well, I can offer you help, but I can't really do the treatment of cancer, but I can get him to my instructor, and then I would scribe for my instructor. And then I'm caught up in my head, well, what if he won't pay, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking, this is taking time. I could be actually in action, but what am I afraid of? So I don't know, something about your talk today made me realize that, that is an opportunity, and macrobiotically, I'm seeing it as one. And also, I do have compassion for him and his family and what he's going through. And yeah, I need to get more into action. And I think that what you said, there's hope in, not only is there fear that maybe I won't help them and maybe they'll resist, but that there's hope in me doing that. And this is my path. So I should be confronting, I think you said, this is an opportunity to move into a situation that, may be uncomfortable. So that's that opportunity. So thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for sharing. You posed a question to yourself, which would be the springboard, kind of jumping off place to look at what's up. And the question you asked is sort of in passing. Not sure how many other people saw that go by, but you asked yourself, what am I afraid of? So what is that?
Well, one thing would be that I have to pay, but money is money, right? But that's okay. Yeah, so I guess it would be having a new level of intimacy with that whole family, which, intimacy is something I do struggle with, but becoming more in the middle, less yang and less yin is also helping me. So it's a good question. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And then further than, because we're armed with this gift and sometime this poison of the unifying principle of yin and yang, I don't know that the heart has a yin and a yang in compassion. So, when we bring our hands together like so, this center point is heart governor point. Sometimes in acupuncture you can massage it, and it's called the palace of weariness, the Chinese point name. And this prayer, which is namaste, I see the divine in you, right? Or in any religion, we're kind of bringing these two parts of our heart together, right? So I sometimes ask people, how big is your heart? How much can you handle? Could you, people say, oh God, how could you handle that, going to Sandy Hook, that school, and seeing those children? Or how could you be on the ground after a cyclone and working with those children, or whatever? And I asked them, well, do you think you could carry a child out of a burning building? If you knew a building was on fire and you knew there was someone's kid in there and they said, go in and get them, you'd probably go, you'd probably do it, right? Could you hold the kid if the kid was covered with burnt 70-80% of her body? It's like, so how big is your heart? And it's actually big. It's not just this big. It's way bigger. Way bigger. And I think that we're kind of afraid of our learned behavior, because you used another word, and the word was should. I'm gonna make that a negative. You shouldn't do anything. Right? There's no requirement. There's no right. Right? There's an opportunity to be present. And it's going to be difficult because it might not work. And you might see him get worse. And you might see him push you away. And you might hear his family say, you're nonsense. There's a lot of possibilities that could make this go way off the rails. Right? Not just he doesn't have the money. So even in the presence of those difficulties, how big's your heart? Right? How big? And that as a social worker, is like really creating this deep place of listening, right,
Mm.
isn't there to fix people, but really to witness their changes, their process, as you are able to witness your own changes and your own process. Huh?
Yeah.
So those two things kind of came up for me when you shared, and I appreciate that you shared so openly with others.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. You know, if we don't have other questions, I'll tell one other story that just came to mind. In 2004, when the tsunami in Sumatra, the earthquake in Sumatra caused a tsunami there, and we all know Phuket and Thailand, India, Sri Lanka. That was a long time ago. That was 18 years ago. December 26th, 2004. 2005, a couple of weeks later, we went there, my son and I and a couple other people on a team. We walked on rubble where there were still bodies underneath. You could smell them rotting. We forgot how big that was. And many of us never really knew, because only a few years before we had the World Trade Center experience where a few thousand people, 3,000 were killed. But I'll ask you, and you could volunteer, anybody who has their mic open, just to take a guess. How many people died? How many people died from that? What do you think? Pick a number and just say it out loud in your mind. Anybody want to take a wild guess out there? There's no harm in being way off. So now that you have that number, the right number is 235,000 people.
I was going to guess 1,000.
235,000 people died. And 2 million people were displaced without a home. 4 million children. So on the third or fourth day we were there, right, we had finished a play shop with the group. Jonah, my eldest son, who is a kind of Pied Piper with kids and an amazing player, was always surrounded with kids and playing with them. And as we were done, we were getting in the van that had taken us to this small village, and 3 or 4 kids came and grabbed Jonah's hand and arm and tugged him, and they wanted to take him and play with him some more. And he was pretty tired. But he looked at me and I went, it's okay, go ahead. And off he went, and they went down the road. And I thought, okay, well, it's going to be a while before I see Jonah again. I guess he's off to do some more playing. And they went down the road and around a bend out of sight. And I kind of stretched out in the van and snoozed a bit, probably for half hour. Wasn't sure how long I was going to be there, and woke up. And then I started thinking, well, where'd Jonah go? It kind of took him away. And sure enough, after 35, 40 minutes, I could see them in the distance coming back, right? And he was holding hands with, a couple on both sides and a few other children around, right? And they walked him back to the van, and he was different. I mean, he had really changed. His face was so open and big, right? And they didn't speak English. They didn't know, right, any way to communicate with him. But, they all waved to him as he got in the van, and he waved and said, bye-bye, bye-bye. And they all went, bye-bye, 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 right? And he snuggled up next to me. He put his head on my shoulder, and off we drove. And then he started to cry. And then when he composed himself, I said, "Where did you go?" He said, "Well, they took me down this road and then they went off into the woods." Right? And we went into the woods, and then we came to this mountain, this kind of hill, this hillside. And then we started to go up this hillside, and then we came to this peak, and you could see the ocean. And like we were right at this most beautiful area of this ocean. And I got that they wanted to show me this landscape, this sight, this view. Right? And then they kept walking, and they walked along the edge. Right? And then they came to this area, right? And they all spread out, 5, 6 of them. And they all stood, right, in different places. And then I realized they were standing next to the graves. And one by one, I went to them, and they said, "My papa, my papa." And the next one said, "My mama, mama." This is where they buried their parents and their sister, their friend. They took me to their grave sites and stood there, and they said, "My papa, papa." And then we came back together and walked back. And he started to cry again, and I cried. How incredible to be in the presence of suffering. My own, my son's sense of hope and grief, right, in one place. Right? How easy it would be to turn away from the invitation, right, to see the graves of parents who died 3, 4, 5 days ago. Right? Right. Please don't resist the opportunity to be in the presence of suffering. Right? It changes us. It breaks our heart open. And then we can create a new boundary, a new edge, a new space in the edges of our heart. Bigger and bigger, much bigger. So we can be in the presence of suffering of others.
What a beautiful, heartfelt story that is. I remember I had a friend whose mother had cancer, and she said that no one really would come around to her house, when her mother was really ill. And I remember I went into her bedroom, and I laid in the bed with her mother. And this is the kind of, situation this reminds me of.
That's beautiful.
It does. It changes you, and it's so powerful. I'm just that kind of person. I'm known in my family with the one with tears. Most of the people in my family don't cry, but there's some reason they're happy tears. Everything moves me to a point like that.
Beautiful.
And I find that with COVID, I have been so isolated that yes, I can do a phone call and support people, but I've isolated so much more, and I don't get those situations like I used to be, where I'm with people,
Right.
you know. And I think that's missing for me right now, that intimacy.
Yeah, that's a terrible repercussion of this pandemic, of the physical separation that we've experienced so often, and
Right.
particularly for the families who have had to watch their loved ones behind a glass, intubated and
Right.
forbidden from holding their hand or being with them. Yeah, that's a
Terrible.
awful, awful reality.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that, Audrey.
Thank you. And you're such a beautiful storyteller.
Thank you.
William,
I agree.
Dr. Spear, is it Dr. Spear?
Oh, goodness, no. There wasn't one ever. I mean, sometimes people even call me Mr. Spear, and I have to tell them that was my father's name.
Let me ask you about, are you ever worried about trauma getting stuck in your body? And because you're macrobiotic, I know that things bounce off of us better, but are you ever, so that would be fear, right? But any thoughts on trauma?
Wow. So first of all, where did you learn that things bounce off of us better? I want some of that. But okay. Trauma, yeah. So that's the reason we work in those areas, because of post-traumatic stress, but not post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress is the thing that you experience when you hit black ice and you come home after it, 3 seconds of loss of control, fear of hitting a concrete abutment or being into oncoming traffic, but riding the car and then getting home and saying to your partner, "Whoo, I hit a patch of black ice. Oh my God, I need a drink," or "I got to go take a hot bath." And for a day or two, you tell people about that black ice patch. But you don't get post-traumatic stress disorder. You get post-traumatic stress. So post-traumatic stress disorder is a phenomena, a syndrome, which has a gestation period. And that is basically 90 to 120 days. So we went to places, to Sri Lanka, where our teams went 11 times, right? To Japan, to Samoa, to the Philippines, to Nepal, right? To all of those places where there were cyclones and tsunamis and tornadoes and disasters, Texas and floods, etc. In the days after, because people were experiencing post-traumatic stress, and they had stories of what happened, but the stories became tape loops. And we now know, and I hope you know as a social worker, that psychological debriefing and cognitive behavioral therapy in trauma is a way to re-traumatize people. It does not help them get rid of the energy of post-traumatic stress, which is now in their body because the issues are in the tissues. They ain't in the brain. So they can tell the story over and over and over and over again. But until they get to scream it out, until they get to pound it out, until they get to wiggle it out, until they get to laugh or cry it out, it stays in their body. And that's when Bessel van der Kolk realized, who's a friend and someone I've worked with, that the body remembers, right? And all those books on trauma now, the Peter Levine's and all the ones I have on my shelf up here, Playground Politics, Sacred Seek, The Body Remembers, The Tao of Trauma, Trauma and Memory. I'm reading the titles off of my bookshelf, all talk about this as being energy in the body, not of story. Right? And the danger is that we tell the story without attending to the energy. So the play shops that we worked on with children, right? Play shops that we led, right? The children love. They wiggle and scream and jump up and down and pretend they're dinosaurs and laugh and cry and roll around and make a lot of noise. And they have a blast for 30 minutes or 40 minutes, and we go and do them over and over again. What they don't realize is that we very carefully crafted 14 exercises drawn from the 5 transformations and Chinese medicine and other sources to help them release and externalize grief and fear and anger and pain. Because all those things which we experience are no longer words or story. They're just energy in the body. So when my children got angry, I'd often tell them to just run around the house and make a lot of noise and go outside and scream. You know, because that's what kids do when they throw tantrums. That's what they want to do. And if we try to talk it through, right, especially weeks later, months later, we're probably too late, and we might be dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's another can of worms altogether. So yeah, trauma, for sure. It's a big, big, big issue and requires a lot of noise making and wiggling, body-centered somatic practices.
Bill, I can't begin to express my thanks and my appreciation and many other words that don't come to mind. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you again for organizing it. It's great, Gennat. What you're doing to bring people together is just spectacular. It's really fantastic. That's true service. Thanks.